Please join me in welcoming our friend Lawrence Wright. Thank you, buddy.
Thank you, Evan.
Good to see you.
My pleasure.
Good. Congratulations on all your success.
Well, thank you.
We celebrate it. Larry, I want to ask you about the motivation for writing this book. Did you write this book for us and for yourself, or did you write this book for them? Did you write this book so that they would better understand Texas, or did you write this book so we would better understand the state we live in? Because it is changing rapidly, and many of us think we know this place, and we maybe don't know it as well as we do. But who's this for?
That's a real interesting question, because originally it started with David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, calling me into his office and asking me to explain Texas.
Good luck, man.
I felt like I'd been called into the principal's office,
seriously,
and asked to account for my behavior.
Yeah.
And but it's hard for a lot of my colleagues to understand why I live here, and because I don't have any business in Texas since I stopped working for Texas Monthly decades ago. And my work is in New York or LA or Washington, or abroad,
right,
but not in Texas. And yet something was keeping me here. So when David posed that question, first of all, I reminded him that I get paid by the word, and just asked a very big question.
Right.
And
everything is bigger in Texas, including your per word fee.
That's
right.
And then secondly, I thought, why am I here? I've wondered that many times, and I suppose we all have different amounts of allegiance to the place that we're living, and there's a question of, is this the right place for me?
Right.
And I thought it would be worth examining the state and trying to sum up for myself what it means to me and why I feel the allegiance that I do to it.
And at an admittedly interesting time in the life of this state. I mean, any time would be interesting to write about Texas, but boy, is Texas right now at the center of so many interesting conversations.
And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, it's going to be more so in the future.
Yeah.
Because Texas is projected to double in size by 2050.
Right.
And at which time it will be almost the size of California and New York combined.
Combined.
And so, what happens here is already determining the future of our country.
And as you point out, the composition of the population will also change dramatically from now to then. It won't just be that the state is that much larger, but it will be by then majority Hispanic.
Right.
We see the trend lines in terms of the city becoming much more urban, completely counter to the Texas myth that Texas is a rural state. Right now we have more big cities than any other state. The Texas of 2050 will be...
Well, yeah, with except of California.
Well, California has as many in the top 10. I think in the top 20, we have the most. And the reality is that while Texas will still be Texas, will always be Texas, the Texas of 2050 will be, in many respects, a different state than it is now. The New Yorker, we know how this magazine stuff works. The writers don't write headlines.
Yeah.
The editors write headlines. Some smart-ass, wine-drinking New Yorker editor wrote the headline to the piece that ran last summer. But the headline was, "America's future is Texas." You've alluded to that already. Do you believe that?
Oh, absolutely.
That we are the leading indicator, or the blocking back, or the bellwether as far as the rest of the country goes?
Not only in the demography, our growth, and you can see the growth in every city in the state.
Right.
But in the economy, in the last quarter of 2017, Texas GDP grew 5.2%.
Right.
There's only one other state in the whole country that reached 4%, Idaho, and I don't know what that story is.
But I'm guessing it's potatoes. I'm going to go with potatoes.
Yeah,
right,
but there was a big piece in the New York Times about California's miraculous economic growth. 3.2%.
Right.
2 full percentage points below that of Texas. No mention of Texas.
And nationally, we're not even at 3% in the country, right? No. So, Larry, let me ask you about the legislature. Of course, this is of great interest to many people in this room. When we do events here, we typically talk politics. I thought we would start with the chunk. It's a pretty significant chunk of the book that deals with Texas politics. That's not what the book is about entirely. Which is the more inscrutable an impenetrable institution? Al-Qaeda, Scientology, or the legislature?
Well, I've spent a lot of time studying cults. You know,
I should ask it about the people. Bin Laden, L. Ron Hubbard, or Jonathan Stickland? If you had to, who's a better character to write about?
You know, if they had like a swap, then you might not notice some of the differences.
I hope the camera's not working. Is the camera working?
Let me put it this way, in a more sober way. You know, these are all people who believe in what they're doing.
This is the legislature now.
Well, let's say these three entities.
Oh, wow.
Scientology,
You're going with it. Okay,
Al-Qaeda,
great.
and the legislature are full with true believers.
Yeah.
And depending on what they believe, they can act for good or ill.
Right.
And so I don't doubt the sincerity of the people in the legislature who are working. You know, it's a huge commitment. And I don't agree with a lot of the things that they're doing, but you know, the same thing is true of other organizations that I've studied. I've seen, you know, belief is a powerful motivator, and it's been maybe a guiding principle in my work. Is you know, writing about people and what they believe, which in journalism has always had a very low ranking in terms, you know, religion, for instance, is along with cooking, or kind of the, you know, back of the newspaper. You know, that you wouldn't pay a lot of attention to it.
Right.
And yet, I find that people behave. You know, religion and other kinds of strong belief systems, sometimes political belief systems, are far more influential in people's lives than casual politics.
Is belief, as far as it goes, connected or disconnected from reality? Connected to or disconnected from reality? Does the fact that somebody believes something necessarily make it true? This is a conversation that came up when Kurt Anderson's book, what is the name of Kurt Anderson's book? Fantasyland? I forgot the name. Kurt Anderson wrote a book recently, I'm blanking on it, about the evolution of the country's belief systems as it relates or does not relate to reality.
Right.
Is your sense that the belief that drives decision-making at the Capitol or in some of these other institutions necessarily the same as reality or connected to facts?
I think all beliefs...
And does it matter?
Belief almost by definition is not reality. You know, you believe something because you experience things that suggest it might be true. But it's different from actually knowing it as a fact and proving it.
Right.
So, you know, economic theories, for instance, are in a gray area between fact and belief, because, you know, sometimes these theories work out and sometimes they don't.
Right.
But, you know, at least they're studied and they relate to reality. But, you know, religious beliefs are, unless you believe that you have seen. You know, the ghost of your mother has come and said, "I'm in heaven." That might not prove the existence of heaven to me, but it did to you. And so, you know, there is that relationship. But most people believe things in part because of the community of belief.
Yeah.
You know, I've been listening to a lot of people talking about what they believe, and typically they say, "We believe this." And I was always looking at the predicate, and then I began to look at the beginning of that sentence, which is we.
The pronoun, right.
We believe. Right. And there's these are communities of belief.
Right.
And when you join that community, there's a sense of solidarity and purpose that's very hard to obtain otherwise. Right. And sometimes the more radical the belief, like Scientology, then the more closely bound the community is. Right. Mormonism is a good example.
Well, in its own way, it's a good transition to talk about the legislature in specifics, because the legislature is in its own way a community of belief, right?
It is,
People in the building are joined on certain issues in believing that the right way forward is X or Y, or disagreeing with that, and that ultimately drives a lot of the activity. I'm interested that you gravitated to the legislature as a topic for this book, or a chunk of it, because I've known you for many, many years, and I swear I never understood your politics or knew what your politics were. you were never transparent about your interest in this, and you were never transparent about what you personally believed. I couldn't have told somebody until about a year ago, Larry Wright is a Democrat or Larry Wright is a Republican, but yet you gravitated to this subject.
Well, it depends. Our lives are, to some extent, controlled by the decisions that are made in that body.
Yeah.
And you also, there are two things. One, as a kind of patriotic Texan, I'm interested in what's going on inside the body. And the other is, as a journalist, I love the characters.
Right.
And so I'm drawn to it.
Had you spent much time in the building before researching this book?
Yeah, I wrote a play years ago called Sonny's Last Shot. We had two productions here in Austin, and it was a lot of fun. It was about a young man from Marfa who gets elected to the House, Texas House, and comes to try to reform campaign finance and gets into a war with a lobbyist. G.W. Bailey played the lobbyist.
Right.
And
but that's years and years ago. That was in a very different time in Texas politics and a very different legislature, right?
It was, but I'm actually working on it now as a musical with Marcia Ball. So,
oh, is that right? Yeah. A musical about the Texas legislature sounds pretty good to me.
Hasn't it always wanted to be one?
Right. Yeah, it's pretty great. What did you think about it coming into the building? When you got into the building as somebody who did not have a ton of experience with the legislature, and you witnessed, as part of the reporting of this book, specifically the 2016 legislative session, that was the sort of narrative a piece of this book. What did you think? What did you imagine when you came in it was going to be like, and what did it end up being like?
I had no idea it was going to be such an epic session.
Yeah.
It just happened to coincide with when I was writing about Texas, and I wanted to cover the politics. I didn't know, except casually, many of the political figures.
Right.
And of course I read the Texas Tribune, so I was up on things. And so I was...
Here's that $5 I promised you.
Yeah. So I knew something about it.
Yeah.
But I guess I had some impression of the reputations that different political figures had.
Yeah.
And actually, I had spent a little time, because there was a point where I was going to take that play, and HBO was going to do a series based on it. And so I spent some time then going through the legislature and talking to people behind the scenes and so on. The legislature wasn't in session at that point.
Right.
But so I knew the terrain. And then, when the legislature starts and you see the agenda that's put out, then I knew that, that it's going to take a startling turn.
What's in this book, in the chapters devoted to the 2017 session, are the big things, of course, the discussion of the bathroom bill, sanctuary cities, but it's also, I think, as interesting to me as somebody who watches this stuff, the little things. There's the fight between Briscoe Cain and John Zerwas over palliative care.
Yeah.
It kind of, laid out end to end. There's the Jonathan Stickland, Drew Springer fight over hogs. Yeah. You kind of got the big stuff and the little stuff, and every one of these people. I mean, I never thought I'd see the words Briscoe Cain in the New Yorker, honestly, but there are these folks who we see every day in this session populating all this.
Yeah, and they're not little things to them. These are subjects of tremendous passion.
Right.
And, it was dramatically laid out. I mean, I compare it to the Montagues and the Capulets when you have the front mic and the back mic and people start to gather.
Yeah.
And it's totally dramatic. And you see the alignments, of these different ideologies and friendships and so on. And it's I always look for, when in my writing, no matter what it is, I'm always interested in character.
Yeah.
It's not just a character in the sense of being a colorful character, but a sense of who are these people at their core.
Yeah.
And, and help, if I can understand that person, I can get more deeply into what they represent and where they're trying to go.
Well, clearly, when you assess the character of the folks in the legislature, you came away with a negative view in the main. All over this book are characterizations of the legislature that are not entirely positive. Here's an example of that. This is you writing about the legislature after the last session. The Texas legislature is far more functional than the U.S. Congress and more genteel than the House of Commons, but a recurrent crop of entertaining crackpots feeds the state's reputation for aggressive know-nothingism. I wish you would tell us what you think. I mean, is that about this legislature and this session, or is that about the legislature institutionally over time?
Oh, we've always had characters like that.
Yeah.
I mean, and I remember when we first moved to Texas and back to Texas in 1980, and the Texas Observer was the repository.
In full flower at the time.
Yeah, all those great stories. And there was, the guy who had himself shot in order to get the sympathy vote.
Mike Martin, yeah.
No, not Mike Martin.
What is the senator's name who had himself shot? Ross, the senator who had himself shot.
From Longview.
From Longview.
House member.
House member. Yeah, well, but so that's...
Yeah, anyway, his House member is important because exactly, Molly Ivins, the Texas Rangers found him hiding in his mother's stereo closet, and Molly Ivins said he always did want to be speaker.
That's a pretty good line. Yeah, that's good.
So,
this is not a new phenomenon.
No, I think probably every state has.
Yeah.
It's, although I've lived in other states, and I don't remember having quite, the level. And the other thing about Texas is that we cherish the kind of colorful characters that we have.
Right.
And, Bob Bullock was a great example. And I personally, I was very fond of Pete Laney. He was really helpful to me when I was working on my play. And he was speaker then, and I asked, I had this young legislator in the plays coming to the legislature to reform politics, and he gets in a war with the lobbyists. And is there something that the lobbyists could engineer that would, really hurt him but not destroy him, And he said, well, you could put a toxic waste dump in his district, and that would mess him up right and left.
Yeah.
And I said, wow, that's a great idea. And then he told me about the poo-poo choo-choo. And that was when which is still going on, right, Ross? New York City waste is being taken down to South Texas.
By train to Sierra Blanca.
Yeah, and so explain that to your constituents. And so... I just fell in love. When you find a guy like that who's he's so inside, and yet he loves he loves the people, he loves the institution, and that impressed me. That's why that House was my favorite political body.
So there are all kinds of characters in this book from the legislature, but you spend a lot of time on Speaker Straus, and you spend a lot of time on Lieutenant Governor Patrick. Speaker Straus took time to talk to you for this book. Lieutenant Governor Patrick, as you describe it, declined repeated requests to be interviewed for this book. I'd make the observation from a journalism standpoint, it's always better to tell your story than to have somebody else tell it. It's like always better to talk to the reporter. Yeah. Speaker Straus is presented in somewhat more of a heroic light in this book.
I certainly see him that way.
Yeah. Talk about the principles. Talk about Straus and Patrick. You wrote a book about Sadat and Begin. I'm not even sure Jimmy Carter could broker the peace accord between Straus and Patrick. But talk about Straus and Patrick.
Well, they're two really remarkable men, and let me talk about Patrick. He grew up in Baltimore. His name was Danny Goeb. And he went off, I think it was to Indiana, and got a start as a sports broadcaster, and then went to Houston. He was not a very successful sports broadcaster, but he did some very colorful things on the radio as well. He had a vasectomy, for instance, on air. He had the Houston cheerleaders paint him blue while he gave the sports scores and that kind of thing. He tried to become a colorful character that people would tune into, but it didn't succeed so much for him. His greatest goal in his life at that point was to host the Tonight Show. And so that was his dream. And then he went into restaurant business. He went into the restaurant business at a time when the Texas economy was just about to nosedive. And he acquired a number of restaurants. And then the economy tanked in the mid-'80s, and he found himself bankrupt. He got in fights with his customers. But this, what's interesting about that is, that's making a lot of money and losing a lot of money is a Texas story. And so he rebuilt his career. Before that happened, he tried to commit suicide. And this became a subject in one of his elections. He checked himself in. He had taken an overdose of pills and he had slit his wrist. And that's the lowest point you can imagine a person being in. And then from that, he went to work for a radio station just outside of Houston that still had some bandwidth that reached into the city. And he picked it up for the debt. It was broke. And he had the amazing fortune to sign this unknown commentator named Rush Limbaugh. And he was the guy who had Rush Limbaugh in Houston. And his fortunes turned around right quickly. And he himself became a shock jock type commentator. And then when he ran for the Texas Senate, I think he defeated 11 people outright. You said to me.
Well, I think he defeated. I know of at least a couple, 3, 4 maybe. But yes, to the point, he did win. He won the election without a runoff.
Right.
Yes.
And you said it was like Rush Limbaugh had run.
Well, it was remarkable. I think nobody saw that coming.
Right.
Yeah.
And now when you see him in his full power and this sort of thing, he seems to me to have completely regenerated himself into a happy man.
Yeah.
He's firm. He's a devout Christian. He wrote a memoir called The Second Most Important Book You Will Ever Read, and a somewhat selective account of his life. And so from that point of view, one has to stand back and admire, the diligence and the persistence that he has to claw his way back to really becoming the most powerful figure in Texas politics.
Right.
And as you observed, probably the most conservative person we ever elected to office.
Now, Speaker Straus on the other side of the Capitol, a big contrast.
Yeah, he has had these, quite in contrast, a very steady life. He comes from a deeply rooted business family in San Antonio. They used to have a saddlery. When Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders came through Texas, they went to San Antonio because of the Frank saddlery, and they outfitted themselves to go to.
This is the Straus family business
for the Spanish-American War.
Right.
And then he and his wife Julie both worked in Washington in H.W. Bush's term. So what you see is a very solid, steady, cautious. I kind of compared him to a madman, the ad executive. That he was. He dresses conservatively. He's by nature not an adventurous figure, but he's a very solid person. And I think he was elected speaker in part because he seemed non-controversial and open to other people. But he was really tested in this particular session because Patrick and others brought in a social agenda and maybe this is because Republicans have been in charge of the state for such a long time that the kind of business conservatism has had its run. Whatever you needed to enact, you've done already. So now this immense amount of social legislation came in. The sanctuary cities, a whole new round of abortion bills, and especially the bathroom bill. All of this was a part of Dan Patrick's agenda. And it, to my surprise, the governor, all during the session, seemed to be totally absent from commenting on this legislation. Previously, I'd always looked at Greg Abbott as being a kind of business conservative in the same mold as Straus.
Right.
But he was holding back. I mean, it was a little unclear to me where he was going. And that left Joe Straus as the one person who was standing in the way of this cascade of social legislation, which I saw as being very damaging to the state.
Yeah.
And I saw his actions as being rather heroic.
Right.
And so I guess that's why I painted him in that light. I thought, he is risking a lot. In my opinion, the Republican Party in Texas has taken some kind of hallucinogen that allows them to think that you can antagonize 40% of the population, the Hispanic population, with the Show Me Your Papers provision of the Sanctuary Cities bill, and young people who are far more tolerant of gay marriage and such things. It just seems like the whole future of that party has been put at risk by, I think, mindless social conservatism.
But Larry, of course, there's a big difference of opinion in the state about that.
Yeah.
You have your opinion. There are people in the state who have a different opinion. And the reality is that as long as the people who disagree with that view of the world don't vote, then nothing changes. You make the point, you quote Wendy Davis saying here, and it's also, Beto O'Rourke has said this, it's a Democratic trope every 2 years. Texas is not a red state, it's a non-voting state. The reality is, because it's a non-voting state, it's a red state.
Yeah.
True, but not accurate, right? So, I mean, what you're saying may be true, but the reality, and you spent a lot of time in this book talking about changes to Houston and Dallas and Austin, El Paso, and other places in the state. But the reality is, everything you're talking about notwithstanding, there's no prospect for any change anytime soon.
There is a prospect for it, and Texas could change, really quickly.
But there's a very big if there.
Yes, if people go vote. And, 29 million Texans, I think over 15 million of them are registered to vote.
Correct.
And in the last election, only 9 million of them did vote. So what's interesting about that is they took the trouble to register. So what does that say? They're interested enough to go register to vote, but they're not interested enough to actually go to the polls. Or, with all this talk about how hard voter ID and stuff like that, you can vote for 2 weeks in Texas, and you can mail in your ballot. You live in New York, where they're so critical of our voting, but you have 1 day. If it's raining, and you have to go to the polls, and you got a meeting or something like that. I think that's real, obstruction to voting. But we have it pretty easy here, and yet people don't do it. And yet people don't do it. And so I've asked myself a lot about why is that, and we've talked about the Hispanic vote, and I think if you subtract the question of ethnicity, and we've talked about this too, who doesn't vote are the young, the poor, and the poorly educated, and there are a lot of Hispanics in that category. Yeah. And so, but many of them are registered. So why did they not vote? And I think the question is they haven't been presented with candidates that with whom they can resonate. Right. And we talk about the future Hispanic candidates like the Castro brothers, but they've never actually offered themselves for statewide office. So how do you know? We had one Hispanic candidate for governor, a Democratic candidate, Tony Sanchez, but one could scarcely call him charismatic. It's the kind of figure that would cause people who have been tempted to vote, but have never actually gone out and done it. That figure is absent from our politics right now.
On the subject of candidates for office, let's make a little news here.
All right.
You actually, in the course of working on this book, came to the conclusion that Texas needed a new governor, and you came very close to running for governor yourself.
Well, yeah, it's true.
Until you woke up and thought, what in the hell am I thinking? But this was actually not an idle conversation. You actually contemplated the possibility if nobody else was going to running yourself.
Yeah, I talked to my wife, Roberta, about this because I didn't want to, I knew you had asked me if you could talk about this, and I asked Roberta if it'd be all right. And she was very opposed to it. But there was a period of time, if you remember, nobody was going to challenge the governor, and because he's unbeatable. And but I thought it shouldn't be the case that he's not challenged. And until he revealed himself as being a social conservative in the same mold as Dan Patrick, I had no quarrel with him. But my concern, when I was looking at the legislature and seeing them talking about the bathroom bill or shooting pigs from balloons, swords, now we can carry swords. This is, these are all major pieces of legislation. This took a lot of time. And what are the real problems in Texas? The number one is education. We're, I think, 49th out of 50th in how much we spend per student. And actually, we get a pretty good payoff because we're only 41st in the ranking of how our students do in the 4th grade, and I think 45th in the 8th grade. I'm not exactly sure about those. But 10% of all the school children in America are Texans. So it's not just our future that we're putting at risk by not educating our children. It's the whole country.
This gets back to the idea that what happens in Texas is disproportionately influential on the national conversation.
And when I was watching what was happening with education in the state, it really upset me. We're all upset about property taxes, but the way that education is funded is 3 sources: federal, which is pretty small, state, and the state is mandated to provide more than 50% of the cost of education for each child. And now it's 39% is what they're actually providing. And then property taxes, which is what gets ballooned up because the state continues to drop its contribution. And then there was an effort on the part of the lieutenant governor and the governor to cap the rise in property taxes, which is solely expanding because of the decreasing contribution of the state itself.
You've become one of us, haven't you?
A nerd?
Yeah, you've become a nerd. That's exactly right.
I'm totally that.
Well, welcome, fellow nerd. We welcome you to this club. But you decided ultimately you didn't think this was something you wanted to do. Better to write for the New Yorker.
Well, yeah, I think to be honest, the chances of anybody winning that race were slim, but I thought it was worth providing a contribution voice.
And you had conversations not just inside your house, but also outside your house about the possibility of running.
Yeah, I even had a fantasy about how the campaign might go. My campaign would have been modeled on Pappy O'Daniel. He took the light crust doughboys around. Bob Wills was the light crust doughboys, and he went around the state playing. I'm in a band, so but half my band voted for Trump, so I don't know that they would have supported me on the hustings. I kind of thought it would be fun, but honestly, it was seen by some in my family as a tremendous invasion of privacy. For what? And that, finally...
You were outvoted.
I was outvoted.
In your house. Step back from the legislature and let's talk about Texas politics in the main. You have a construct in this book that I think is very interesting, AM Texas versus FM Texas, as a way to try to understand the differences in the state.
Yeah.
Explain that. I think that's a really good, that's got some staying power as a way to think about the state and its politics.
Well, you can drive through Texas and it can take, half the month to do so, but and you can be in 2 states at the same time. You can be in AM Texas, and AM Texas is, very right-wing, evangelical. It's where you'll find Laura Ingraham and Rush Limbaugh, and of course Alex Jones, our own contribution, and it presents a view of America and the state that is one of alarm and despair, and one I find very intolerant. And then you turn on the FM band, and it's the kingdom of NPR. It's progressive, it's urbane, cosmopolitan. It's like being in California. It's just, which is the reason there's this antagonism between Texas and California in the political minds in the state.
Is it necessarily the case that FM Texas is the cities and AM Texas is the non-cities? Is it as simple as geography?
Partly is that the FM band doesn't reach outside the cities a lot of times.
Yeah.
But I think there's a tremendous urban, suburban, rural split. And the cities in Texas are all blue. Even Fort Worth, the main part of Fort Worth.
Although Tarrant County itself is the outlier. Right?
Tarrant County has the reddest part of the state in it, perhaps. But the suburbs, I think, are becoming a little disaggregated now. And I talked to Karl Rove about how it was that Texas became red in the first place. Because when I was growing up in Abilene and Dallas, it was blue. Texas was blue. California was red. And I see these two states, the biggest state and the second biggest state, like strands of DNA. They're always in relation to each other, but never actually coinciding. But the whole body politic of America is engaged in this relationship because California is the biggest blue state. And it hasn't in 10 years had a statewide Republican elected. And its Republican Party is about as wounded as an animal as the Democratic Party is here. And here we haven't had a Democrat elected in more than 20 years.
Right.
So, and yet the whole country, of the top 10 cities, 3 in California and 3 in Texas, that leaves only 4 in the whole country that aren't in Texas or California. And California has had an economic miracle that has been able to come back from the chaos that it was in less than a decade ago to create a budget surplus of $6 billion. And here, the fiscal conservatives have created, I can't get it straight, is it $6 billion or $8 billion we're in the hole, Ross? $8 billion, okay. Where are the fiscal conservatives actually living?
You think that the real fiscal conservatives are in California?
Well, based on the fact that they've balanced their budget.
But California is, of course, the boogeyman, the punching bag for this legislature. You heard your report on this in the book repeatedly, "Don't California my Texas," over the course of the...
Even in my band, my drummer has a sticker on his drum kit that says, "Don't Californicate Texas music," which I don't know what that means.
We have no idea what it means. But, interestingly enough, and we'll kind of stop-ish right here and go to the audience with questions in a second. Austin is in many respects in this conversation about California versus Texas. You describe in this book Austin as the spore of the California fungus.
Yeah.
Right? That the way that the state in the main views California as an antagonist or as the antithesis of Texas, they view Austin specifically. Austin is always in the target, always in the sights of the state.
It's interesting because by some measures, if you look at, the most liberal cities in America, Austin is maybe the most liberal city in the entire southern tier of the United States, from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. If you drew a line across the states, then Austin has a more consistently blue record. But on the other hand, judging by the metrics that the conservatives themselves would use, such as entrepreneurialism, Austin number 1. The job growth. Well, Houston and Dallas between 2000 and 2014 grew 31% more than in jobs, more than 3 times that of LA. Austin grew 50%. Much higher than somewhat less liberal cities. All the metrics that we would use to say that business is growing, people are happy with their government. Austin exemplifies, and yet they rail on Austin, and it's personally annoying to me because I love this city, And, when the governor goes out and says, when he leaves Travis County, he can smell freedom, I don't think he's gotten around very much. I've been in countries where I'm so grateful to have that American passport. And I see what the absence of freedom really means. It's not plastic bag bans and tree ordinances. But those are the things that he thinks of when he compares Austin to California.
But you know, Larry, that the reality is Austin as a target or as a punching bag is a successful political strategy. You make the point that outside of Texas, this is again a quote, living in Austin is forgivable in a way that living in Texas is not. That's the perception outside of the state. Inside the state, it's the exact reverse. Remember Ted Cruz during the, during the presidential campaign, would talk about the People's Republic of Austin.
I very well remember when people were hissing him, and he said that.
People's Republic of Travis County.
And you said your constituents.
Well, they are his constituents, right? But that is really the contrast. I mean, the fact is Austin is kind of its own little isolated thing compared to the rest of the state. Outside the state, Austin is seen as a positive, but inside the state, Austin is a political argument that is leveraged to good effect.
But I think it's based on a myth. Yeah. The myth is that Austin is strangling the kind of entrepreneurial heart of the city and the state.
You just
whereas actually it is most fertile ground imaginable. I think I talk a lot about what's a real Texas story in Austin. I think is how the city in our time here has been transformed into. It's a tech city. Well, where did that start? It started with a young man in the Dobie dorm, a freshman pre-med student who started building computers in his room. His name was Michael Dell. And all of this goes back to that kid in the dorm. Mike Levy, came to town in the late 70s and started a magazine that was really kind of unique, a state magazine that was actually not something for Chamber of Commerce. And I and you and a lot of other writers moved to town and created a literary community that now has become such a distinctive part. Yeah. There was a guy named John Mackey who had this little organic grocery store, first organic grocery store in America. It was down at the bottom of the hill on North Lamar, and the Memorial Day flood wiped him out, but his customers and his vendors helped him restock the shelves. And a few years later, it's a Fortune 500 company, Whole Foods. And now we have the best grocery stores in the whole country. In each of these cases, Clifford Antone, people that have come with an idea of something they want to create. They were entrepreneurs. They moved to Austin because of its ethic. There's something about, what was mysterious to me when I moved here in 1980 is that people were already saying Austin is cool. Well, that wouldn't be the word I would have used to describe it in 1980. Slack comes to mind. There were unpaved streets downtown, and it was a sleepy spot. A lot of hippies, kind of still up in the trees, and it was not, and yet it had a reputation. And I think because of its reputation, people moved here attracted to the idea that it was a cultural oasis, it was a music place, it was becoming a tech place. The immigrants made Austin more like its reputation. So, and then 30 minutes after they arrived here, they became nostalgic for the way Austin used to be.
You're right. The reality is there were only good old days. There were no bad old days, and there were no good new days. Let's open it up. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. Oh God, Robert Morrow, here.
Robert Morrow, local political activist. It's an honor to be featured in your book.
Yes.
Robert Morrow, a local political activist here. It's an honor to be featured in your book. On page 128, you talk about how you had the fortune to fly on Governor George W. Bush's personal plane, a King Air turboprop, which really caught my eye. So the question I have for you is, did you know that author Daniel Hopsicker has investigated that plane which has an FA registration number of N6308F.
Let's do the question.
And a serial number of BB1014. And that's the exact same plane that CIA drug smuggler Barry Seal used to fly before he was murdered by George Herbert Walker Bush and Oliver North in February of 1986 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
I'd have to say that comes as a total surprise to me.
Okay. Next question. Honestly, given the way that it could have gone, that was a relatively tame question for you.
Awesome. That was really awesome. Hi, my name is Ana Garza Franklin. I'm an entrepreneur.
Yes.
I have a little startup film company called Real Fine Films. It's based in Texas, you may have guessed.
Yeah.
I'm a mom, I'm a sister, I'm a daughter. I have a transgender youth daughter.
Okay.
And I'm concerned, you mentioned something about entrepreneurialism, sort of getting stifled a little bit. It's a tiny bit, and it is because of the influx of jobs. But it's the borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. It's bringing jobs that were existing elsewhere, not creating new jobs, just moving them in. And so we're just crowded. That needs to stop.
What do you think about that?
We need to get that entrepreneurial, get that light in that entrepreneurial spirit again. Thank you.
Well, I think right now the whole country is in a kind of full employment stance. It's going to be harder for startups,
Right.
just to get the labor.
Yeah.
And I've thought a lot about this Amazon second headquarters. Suppose it came to Austin. Everybody's already working. You know, our unemployment, the real unemployment rate in Austin is in the 2s. And where do 50,000 new workers come from? And what's it going to be like when they're out on our streets? You know, you can imagine, you know what it's like when summer comes and suddenly the traffic, you can go into a restaurant without a reservation and suddenly
All the UT people and all the rich people are gone.
So
Right.
you've just subtracted 50,000 students. Imagine what it's like when you add that 50,000 on top of what we already have. And that's just the workers, not their families and, dogs and cats. But, that's one of the things I'm most concerned about, aside from education, is the infrastructure.
Yeah.
Because, Austin's infrastructure is not as bad as you see in Dallas and Houston and the big cities where the streets are in such horrible shape. But cities, Dallas and Houston are both supposed to be 10 million each by 2030. That's only 12 years from now. And the whole state being, more than double, and the state is doing very little to plan to accommodate that kind of growth.
Yep.
So it's just going to be, I think, a nightmare in the future because we just haven't, and
Yep.
that doesn't even talk about having to protect our coastal cities from the kind of destruction that we saw last fall.
Last year. Well, the mayor seems as ambivalent about Amazon as you do. So,
Yeah.
In the back. Yes, sir.
Hi, good morning. My name is Luke Metzger. In 13 Days in September, you tell a really interesting story about how the Camp David Accords are about to fail, and Menachem Begin's packing his bags and leaving, and Jimmy Carter comes over. Before he leaves, he's promised to deliver these signed photographs to give to Begin's grandchildren. And rather than just write "Best wishes, Jimmy Carter," he's taken the time to figure out the names of Begin's grandchildren and writes it, personally writes this note to them. And Begin is so moved by this gesture, it basically helps save the Accords. And so normally in politics, we say nice guys finish last. I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of how effective kindness can be as a political strategy.
Is decency dead and is decency ineffective, or is it the inverse?
It's not dead.
I think that, we're in a course period of our politics. It's not as if we haven't been in that situation before in our country, but I think decency and civility still have the capacity to surprise, and especially in this environment. I think it's useful to imagine people who can reach across and I think this next election, I think who knows what's going to happen, but I think it's going to add a little more complication to our political system that'll probably encourage a little bit more bipartisanship. But the kind of rough handles that we've been dealing with.
You think the center will reassert itself a little bit?
A little bit.
Yeah.
I'm not looking for a transformation.
Right.
But there hasn't been a need to work together.
Yeah.
Because, this extreme partisanship and the fact that, the one party is in total control
Yeah.
of everything except itself, then, that has obviated the need for compromise. And that's where the test of civility actually comes.
Let me push back on that and offer a counter view of that, which is that the departure of Speaker Straus is evidence that reaching across the aisle is a political liability, or has been a political liability, and that the politics of the moment makes working with the other side into a campaign mailer. That in fact, rather than thinking that the center will reassert itself, all evidence may be to the contrary, and that the center may be more dead rather than less dead, or civility may be more dead rather than less dead, despite the fact that we may wish civility to reassert itself. Is that
I agree with your analysis. It's just that I think that going down that road is like driving a car at high speed to a brick wall.
Yeah.
Because it's.
But it feels pretty good until you hit that wall, doesn't it?
I think that's exactly what's going on right now. We've got teenagers at the wheel, and what we need. I think that there are going to be real consequences. Let's say, in the next session they succeed in passing that bathroom bill. Well, you saw what happened in North Carolina. Do you think it's not going to happen in Texas?
Well, I can tell you that for a certainty, because he sat here and said it in his own words, that the lieutenant governor most assuredly does not think that it will happen, and he thinks that the predicate to this conversation, that there was some bad thing that happened in North Carolina, is actually a fiction.
Well, he may be making up those figures. What I've been reading is that the economy has suffered, and a lot of companies decided that they were not going to invest in North Carolina. The NFL threatened. No more Super Bowls or, in Texas. Why wouldn't they follow through on that? Yeah. I think it's, willful denial of the facts on the ground. And North Carolina's not growing like Texas is growing. We've got a lot more at stake. And also, it doesn't help our reputation to be so mean-spirited to people who are, in many cases, in a vulnerable situation.
And that's actually, maybe this is the place where we'll end. That's also something that you call out in this book quite a bit. That over the modern period of Texas, what we have lacked more than anything is compassion.
Yeah.
You make the point of saying that you believe elected leaders and institutions here lack compassion, and that is just, as the kids would say, a bad look for this state.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that Texas is, it has the future in its hands. Not just our state, it has the future of the whole country, and to some extent, the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And, the kinds of decisions, the kind of people that we decide to be have these immense consequences. And so we have to be able to, we're going to lead. It's just a question of which direction we're going to lead the country.
Right.
And, I think we need to, as voters, make decisions about people that are going to push us in the right direction.
Right. If we don't get it right here, we're not going to get it right every place else.
That's right.
So good. Larry Wright, give him a big hand. Thank you very much. Thank you. See you tonight.
Yeah, we'll do it again.